And so I would be remiss if I did not ask you, when you were prepping for against a debate with Vice President Pence, what is your suggestion for Kamala Harris? How can she prepare? We know that Pete Buttigieg is sitting in as Mike Pence. Sweet Jesus, is that not ironic? But I would love to get your take on what advice you would give her. An hour ago, NBC News and the Wall Street Journal released a poll showing Biden with a staggering 14 points lead. This is up from an 8-point lead before the debate on Tuesday. The poll was taken after the Trump debate, but before Trump's diagnosis. Another poll from the New York Times and Siena College draws a similar conclusion, that voters were turned off by Trump's aggressive behavior at the debate. In that poll, Biden is ahead by a comfortable margin in both Florida and Pennsylvania, swing states for Trump the last 4 years ago. Joining me now is Virginia Senator and former Democratic Vice Presidential candidate Tim Kaine to break it all down for us. Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Maria Teresa.
I want to talk to you because everybody right now is obviously talking and concerned about the president's health and talking about the importance that he may be actually accessing different therapies than other individuals have, even though they too are suffering from COVID. What do you talk about this asymmetrical healthcare system that we live in, that even Chris Christie can step in and go and check himself into the hospital with COVID systems when we know that millions of Americans are unable to do that?
Maria Teresa, it shows it as graphically as it can that we still have huge inequities in our healthcare system. Look, we want the president to recover. I mean, we need him to recover from this, because the last thing our country needs now is, more chaos and uncertainty. And we want him to get the best treatment possible. So that's all good. And we have such great practitioners and institutions like Walter Reed. But the problem is so many Americans don't have that access. And as fate would have it, right after the election in November, the Supreme Court is taking up the Trump administration's efforts to destroy the Affordable Care Act, to take health insurance away from millions, to leave those tens of millions with pre-existing conditions out in the cold. And you just couldn't, heighten in a more dramatic way the dangers of a policy that would strip more Americans from their health care at a time of such suffering. Let's pray the president recovers, but let's also pray for a realization now that we need to be giving more Americans access to health care, not less.
Absolutely. And I also want to talk a little bit about how there was this confusion on what the president's doctor was saying and his chief of staff was saying. I used to be a congressional staffer. Nothing was ever read without multiple eyeballs looking at a document. Can you talk a little bit of that process? Because I think folks are genuinely confused.
And Maria Teresa, I'm confused. But this is just kind of part of the package with these guys, the mixed messages around COVID, the mixed messages around so many things. So yesterday, the president's physician, basically painted a very sunny picture about how the president was doing. That's great. But then there was at first an unnamed source, and it was later revealed to be the chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who talked about the fact that there were really troubling signs with the president, and particularly with respect to a dropping blood oxygen level, which is one of the most troubling aspects of coronavirus. There's also significant confusion over when the president realized he was sick. And then that's relevant because he was doing all these public events at the golf course in Bedminster, certainly the flights with staffers and others this week. And now we see all these Senate colleagues of mine coming down with COVID. So there's just a real significant level of confusion about exactly what went on when the president knew he was sick, and was he exposing others after he should have been quarantining in the White House.
And I think the timeline is quite important, but I want to talk a little bit about your colleagues in the Senate right now that have been diagnosed with COVID and others that are self-quarantining that disproportionately make up the Judiciary Committee. We're now hearing from your colleague, Mitch McConnell, that he wants to actually undertake virtual committee hearings for processing the Supreme Court, the potential Supreme Court justice. What's your take on that?
Well, to take your last question first, there's no way we should do a Supreme Court nomination hearing virtually. Everybody should be there in person. This is the single most appointment that the Senate makes in its advise and consent role as somebody to have life tenure on the Supreme Court. And we shouldn't do this virtually, and we also shouldn't do it until everybody can safely be in the room together. That's only fair.
Well, and I think a lot of these committee hearings, folks don't realize that when you are in the room, you get a different sense of something. You get a different sense of what the person is doing, and in some cases, you could actually disrupt it, as we saw in during Kavanaugh's hearing, of protesters, and you lose those elements. Are you concerned that by doing virtually, that you would actually basically be redlining what the American people are actually seeing and actually experiencing?
Yeah, yes, and you also make the senators less able in their questioning, because when we're in committee hearings live, we usually have staff members sitting right behind us who are reminding us, hey, here's what needs to happen, or you should ask this. And as a former Hill staffer, you know, an awful lot of the good work is done.
We're your external hard drive.
Right. But in the virtual hearings that we do now, for example, I'm in a room by myself. My staff might send me a text that I may or may not get when I'm talking to a witness. Plus, you see somebody's credibility live in a way you don't in a virtual setting. And the credibility and honesty and character of somebody is much easier to assess when you're doing it live. So we need to do these live, and we shouldn't do them live till we can safely do them live.
And so I would be remiss if I did not ask you, when you were prepping for against a debate with Vice President Pence, what is your suggestion for Kamala Harris? How can she prepare? We know that Pete Buttigieg is sitting in as Mike Pence. Sweet Jesus, is that not ironic? But I would love to get your take on what advice you would give her.
Two Hoosiers, right? A Hoosier sitting in for another Hoosier. Look, I think the Kamala's going to do very well, but you got to remember the vice president, he was a radio talk show host. He made his living as a communicator before he was in politics. And so she's got to prepare for that. She's very, very good. But here's a key thing, Teresa, that's very different. In 2016, both tickets were, neither were incumbents. And so the debates were largely about, here's what we'll do if we get the chance. The Trump-Pence ticket is an incumbent ticket. And so it gives Kamala Harris, the prosecutor, the ability to argue evidence. 10 million jobs lost in the last year, 200,000 plus people dead, the deficit and debt exploding, social unrest unlike we've seen in the 1960s. And she gets to look at a vice president and say, you are the head of the coronavirus task force. Are you going to apologize to the American public for how poorly this has been handled? She gets to argue evidence, and that was a different feature 4 years ago when neither ticket was an incumbent.
I think you're absolutely right. Pence is going to have to answer to those lives lost as well. Thank you, Senator Kaine, for joining me. Mil gracias.
Mil gracias de nada.